You know, at first when I started this project, I thought I was doomed because I didn't have the instruction sheet and I couldn't get a new set. But luckily, I had my other Stug III on hand in order to help with the build. What was that noise? Oh my god! Hey everyone, this is John from ausf.G and I want to welcome you all today to a brand new episode of Old Tank Repair. In this video, the vehicle getting the rebuild treatment is this 1990s vintage second generation Tamiya Stug III ausf.G. This model here started off just like with the other OTRs in the OTR lineup, where it was one of my youthful builds. I built the model back in the day, made a bunch of mistakes on it, and then to add insult to injury, the model's condition just progressively deteriorated from that point onward to the point where we have it at the start of the project. In this video, we're going to be starting off with the model in that condition, and I'm going to be taking you, the viewer, along throughout the entire restoration process. And I'm going to show basically everything that went into this build, bringing it up to the condition that we have here. Because of this, there's going to be a metric ton of information to be shown and discussed in this video, and because of that, this is definitely going to be a longer format video compared to my usual and typical standard model showcase videos. Because of the length of the video, this may be the type of thing you want to watch in segments, or you could go ahead and hit that little gear icon in the corner in order to speed it up. Whichever way you choose to enjoy this video, just sit back, relax, and we'll go ahead and get this one started off. But before I do, as I mentioned before, this model here is built for my own personal collection. It's not for sale and or purchase. However, I often take on commission build vehicles and models from kits ranging between 1/35 scale all the way up to 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and kick this video off. And here's the model, or I should say what's left of it, at the start of the rebuild. This model here started life as a 1/35 scale Tamiya second generation German Stug III ausf.G kit that was released in the mid-1990s time frame. This particular model over here, I purchased it in the late 1990s. I want to say 1998, between there and the year 2000. Just roughly around those whereabouts. The model was procured from my local hobby shop, and I picked it up in an uneventful trip there with my father and my grandmother, and that was basically it. So I bought the model, I opened it up in the car, examined the runners, and off I went home and I built the model basically up to the condition that we have here. And normally this would be the point of the build where I would say, well, it sat in that same location for 20-something years, and, you know, finally I brought it on the table here in order to do the rebuild. Well, that is still true, but it does have a slight detour. Like I said before, the tank was finished in the year 1999, 2000, whereabouts. And then in the year 2001, my dad and I were getting into 1/6 scale armor modeling, and we were contacted by an individual out in Singapore who actually wanted to hire us to build him a Stug III ausf.G. Well, we took the project on, and actually we built 3 of them, all totally scratchable, with full interiors, no cast resin, no 3D print. I mean, everything was hand-built. It was just mind-blowing that we were able to do that. But regardless, the pictures, by the way, are found on, not even on the ECA website. I have them on my old hard drive. Regardless, the models in question were based off of, well, this vehicle that we have here. This was the only Stug III ausf.G that I had in my 1/35 scale tank collection. So we took it out of the cabin and we used it to scale up the 1/6 scale counterpart. Well, after the year or two where it was utilized for that purpose, this model was then placed into the cabinet, and there it stayed for 20-something years. So fast forward to last year, I was working on a vintage Tamiya first generation Stug III ausf.G kit. That model, of course, I went ahead and built it, and that can be seen in its own model showcase video. However, like I stated in that video, that model was missing the instruction sheet, and I wasn't able to procure a replacement, so I had to go ahead and find something to use as a builder's aid. Fortunately, this fella here came back in handy. I basically took him out of the dustproof cabinet, or dust-proof. I'll get to that momentarily. And I set him in the shop, and I basically used him to monkey see and monkey do my way through the other build. And it worked like a charm. I was able to get that model fully built and completed. And that one is, now sitting in my collection. In fact, I'm looking at it right now through the place where I film. Regardless, the most strangest thing happened. After I was done with that model, I went to put this one away, and basically the dramatization that we saw in the pre-video intro, that's literally what happened. I went to put this model away, and next thing I know, it just crumbled on me. It just fell apart like the car from the Blues Brothers. And I'm like, well, looks like I know who's going to be added to the OTR lineup now, and here we are. So let's go ahead and bring the camera in closer, and let me just point out, the model in its current condition. Like I stated before, this fella here was built totally stock, out of the box. There's no PE or any other type of aftermarket add-ons that I added to this model. It's as bare bones OOB as you can possibly get. Bringing the model in closer, first thing I just want to point out is the model's camouflage pattern. This is something that was actually a real camouflage pattern. There was a real Stug III FG with this exact same color scheme. I got the camouflage pattern from a Squadron either walk-around book or in an action book. Regardless, I actually have the book. I saw the illustration there. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. That's how I'm painting this model, and that's the paint job that you see on it. Really distinctive. It may or may not keep this camouflage scheme. We'll see how that pans out as the rebuild commences. But regardless, the model was painted with the, tools of the trade that I had at the time. The paint is Tamiya Dunkelgelb for the base coat. The green and brown are exterior latex, much along the lines as I do today. However, the airbrush was much more rudimentary compared to the one I'm using now. The airbrush that applied this camouflage scheme was done with a single action Paschi airbrush. And as I frequently mention, I'm not really a fan of single action airbrushes. Double actions are just way more superior in terms of paint flow and airflow, and you really get more of a control over the flow compared to a single action. And when you're rolling with a single action, this is basically the type of work you're going to expect. Now, granted, my skills were much more rudimentary back then when I was younger, but still, in my opinion, the double action is still a much more superior airbrush. Well, continuing on, one thing I did not do back then was I did not glue the wheels on. This was a benefit. The reason why I didn't glue the wheels on was, I came from building older Tamiyas where, the wheels were supposed to roll, so the concept of gluing wheels on to a Tamiya was just, mind-numbingly just blasphemous, so I didn't do that. And also the track kind of holds everything in place. However, that actually came to be a benefit because, fast forward to 2023, I can now take each and every one of these wheels off and thoroughly clean them and prep them and then remount them when the time does come, and it's going to assist with the rebuild much more easily compared to if I glued them on back then. So it looks like I was forward thinking at the time. The remainder of the build is fairly clean. Let's see. The wheels line up fairly well. I'm not seeing the torsion bars all janked like I have seen some of my older builds, like the other OTR Jagdpanther Tamiya build that I did a little while ago. So far so good in that realm. I can see the swing arms here. Yeah, they appear to be properly assembled. So is the idler. The idler cluster also appears to be pretty good. This is something that would have given me a hard time back in the day. In fact, if we go back to the WWII Panzer III OTR build, this was something that was a complete disaster, and that was something I had to address on that build. But so far in this one, it seems to be pretty good. It seems to be pretty clean. Now, normally I always say that in these OTR builds. I'm like, oh, it doesn't look like it's going to be that complicated or that much work. And then, SpongeBob time card later and the thing's a complete mess and I have to rebuild it also. Knock on my wooden table here. This one so far seems to be relatively easily repaired.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
The one thing I do notice about the suspension, though, is I am missing a road wheel. I cannot seem to track it down. I looked in my shop and looks like that one might be gone to Lost Partia. So it looks like I am going to be making a mold of a Tamiya Panzer III wheel. I do have a mold of a Revell, or just a Vintage Dragon Panzer III wheel, but it's not going to be matching up with the continuity, so I'm probably going to have to make a mold of another Tamiya one. I am also apparently missing a spare wheel too, so I couldn't even rely on the spare to help me out on this one. So there goes that. The little nails over here that hold on the track appear to be all in decent shape. We'll see how they survive the paint stripping process. And by the way, I just plucked it right off. I wasn't even sure I could even do that, so that's good. That means I can thoroughly strip this down without any problems per se. The biggest work on this model is, of course, going to be the track. As you can see, the original single-piece vinyl track just dry rotted to oblivion on this one, so clearly I'm going to have to find a replacement track solution. Fortunately, I actually have a set coming in from Ryefield Models. It's a set of workable track links. I utilized them on another Stug III build. It was a Stug III ausf, and those tracks were absolutely awesome. I love those tracks. In fact, you're going to see a track assembly tutorial video following the release of this video here, because I've lately been doing a few tutorial videos on how to assemble these workable tracks. So definitely stay tuned for that. But needless to say, those tracks should fit the build perfectly for this build. As for this track here, this one's in the same shape. It is rock solid. This thing, these tracks are toast. As for why these tracks build up, again, there's a lot of factors that go into play with something that can cause this on these type of tracks. It's a mixture of both environmental as well as even paint. As I always mention in my videos, whenever I do a model that has single-piece vinyl tracks, I always say, don't use spray paints to paint single-piece vinyl tracks, and this is actually the reason why. I have noticed on some tracks that they do have a negative reaction to the paint, and it can cause something like this. So if you don't want this happening to your single-piece vinyls, don't use spray paint. It's super convenient, super affordable, super easy to do, but you're going to pay for it in the long run. Now, I have painted tracks without, with the spray paint, and they held up just fine. But it is a roll of a dice. A lot of times these spray paints, they change the formulas on you, and you just don't know. There's too many conflicting factors going on at play, and also it could be environmental. It could be too dry, it could be too wet. Regardless, I always found it best to just use Tamiya acrylics for the single-piece vinyls and call it a day. Also, as a quick recap, all the tanks that I've painted now that are aging with the Tamiya paint method seem to be holding up perfectly fine. So far it seems that my hunch of painting the tracks with Tamiya acrylics seems to be panning out quite well. So continuing on with the screw-ups, not really too much going on. The Pioneer tools appear to be glued on properly. I'm not seeing too much going on here. The low lift hooks, which have always been a bane for me on these older kits when I was a younger builder, they don't seem to be janked or anything like that. It looks like I am missing something that goes over here. I see some kind of an indentation point. I'm not sure what it is. I do have, by the way, in full disclosure, another brand new Tamiya Stug III ausf.G kit in my stash, and I'm going to be obviously building that as a companion with this fella here, so the other one can take up the slack where this one is deficient, i.e. making some duplicate copies. But we'll see how that pans out as the two builds commence. Did I just pronounce it as Stug over there? Nah, it's Stug. I always pronounce it as Stug. That's how I always pronounce it. And yeah, haters gonna hate. Anyway, so the whole model is, by the way, glued together with Tesser's red tube glue, as I frequently mention in these videos. This was the way I used to build models for the longest period of time, and you're getting red tube type decay, which is perfect if you're doing a rebuild like this one over here. Not so great if you're just trying to build a model and have it last. So that is definitely not something that I recommend. As I often mention in these videos, never use Tesser's red tube on your plastic models. There are better adhesives out there. Red tube is definitely not one of them. Okay, so I popped the side skirt off. The side skirt rails are actually in fairly decent shape. I'm not sure if they are properly built. It does seem like it's going up in an angle over here when I believe they should be straight, so I'm not sure if that's something that's going to need to be addressed. But again, we'll see how that works. I'm just going to go ahead and control break this guy off right now. Screw it. There we go. So all of the side skirt components on this side seem to be assembled in a more proper manner. I did paint and weather the back sides of the skirts, as I always do. And yeah, let's just go ahead and crumble these off into oblivion. Just Thanos snap these guys. It looks like I did try to white glue these components in place, the wheels, just to prevent them from running around. And again, that was actually a good idea because it allowed me to get to the rebuild and properly strip them off, which you will see later. The next thing that I noticed is that armor plate seems to have those stupid tick marks. As I mentioned, a lot of my models were screwed up by doing that back in the day. That's what I get for paying attention to Fine Scale Modeler. Yeah, don't do that. That magazine, yeah, they got some building techniques and tips that aren't exactly the best. But yeah, there you go. Dremel tick marks. So this is something that's going to have to be taken care of. It looks like they did it to all the applicant armor for some reason. And on that note, it looks like I added some Dremel weld marks on several of the locations. So that's going to require some elbow grease to clean up. Nothing out of the normal for the OTRs, that is. But, you know, it just comes with the territory. The paint is fairly thinly applied. It's not overly thick, but it doesn't matter anyway. The denatured alcohol is going to make quick work of that. The next thing to mention is the main barrel. Cracked right off. So the barrel itself appears to be in one shape. I do see a seam that's running through. Obviously, it's a two-piece assembly. You know, that's customary. We're going to have to polish that down. I don't see it cracking up any further like on the Bulldog OTR. That thing just basically just disintegrated. Oh, look at that. I did the staple trick for the single-piece vinyls. Yeah, that's this is actually still a viable technique, believe it or not. It still is, but it's just not one that I need to do anymore because I never really need to do it. I got pretty good with assembling single-piece vinyl tracks. This one over here, it looks like it's hanging on for dear life. it's like the people in Pompeii. They're like frozen in their last position. Yeah, that's basically this track over here. Yeah. Okay. Spare tracks are just slid in place. I did not glue them, which is great. Removing them is going to be problem-free. Oh, the one thing I did here, I can see I used my old-school spring antenna system. Back in the day, John thought that antenna bases were springs, so he actually used to bend his own little spring antenna wires and mount them on his models. Yeah, this is not going to work. I do have replacement German AFE antenna bases. I 3D printed them, and I have them on hand, so they're probably going to be coming in handy for this build here. Looking at the model further, I can see that I made some new side skirt clips out of metal because the plastic ones must have not held up. So yeah, that's typical for me to do. That's still something I'd probably do today, actually, if I don't have a plastic one or a cast rest replacement on hand. Like I said before, there's no photo etch. The MG shield here was a piece that was always breaking off on this model. I always remember re-gluing it constantly. And I do have the MG. The MG is in MG42. Is the stock Tamiya one. It looks like it's in pretty decent condition. The only thing that's broken a little bit is the clip there, but I think I could manage with remounting it in place. You know, it's just going to be cleaned up and, you know, basically arsenal refinished, I guess is one way to put it. That's basically it. Oh, we are missing the no-tech light. That popped off eons ago, so I am going to have to get a replacement of that. The smoke grenade launchers do have their cable detailing in them. That is something that it was a pretty ahead of its time, and I fabricated out of small, thin nylon string, which was the way I used to do it back in the day. Now I use thin floor wire, but I believe I might not even mess with that. It depends how clean the other parts are. The grenade launchers seem to be mounted adequate. I don't see them being improperly mounted or anything like that, but, you know, we'll see how that pans out, again, as the build goes on. Sometimes something looks good until I compare it with how it's, you know, supposed to be, or, you know, illustrating the instructions, and then sometimes it may or may not be accurate. So we'll see how that works. But so far, knock on wood, I'm really not seeing this build to be that problematic compared to some of the other ones. The model back in the shop, I'm now going to go ahead and prep it for the dunk. First thing I'm going to do is pluck off the loose bits like the spare track, the tools, maybe loosen them up quite a bit. Oh, great. It looks like I mounted on the taillight in reverse, so that's something I'm going to have to take care of right now. So after a few moments with an X-Acto, the tools popped right off the model. It was a nice clean break, no other complications whatsoever to be mentioned, and I'm just going to go ahead and set these aside because they will be taking the dunk. All right, so at this point here, I'm actually going to go ahead and take off the wheels just so I could thoroughly strip them out. Also help clean off the suspension swing arms when the dunk does occur. The return rollers, they could stay on. They're not hurting anybody. That's donezo. All right, so now let's go ahead and really get to the satisfying bit, which is breaking up the the petrified track that we have here. So here we go. Well, I'm pretty sure some people would consider that to be something like an ASMR. And looks like this track here, I also did the staple trick in order to keep the track in place. Alright, so I'm just going to get these track shards to the side over here. They'll promptly be thrown to the garbage. And I'm going to just remove the remainder of the row wheels. And from here, I can go ahead and prep the model for the dunk further. So at this point, I have all the parts strewn here on the table that are separated from the model itself. For the really fine components like the tools, the tail light, and some of the other smaller fittings, I'm going to be submerging them in this little spring jeweler's cleaning ball thing that we have here. This item I picked up off of Amazon a little while ago, and I've already mentioned it in another OTR video. These things are excellent, specifically if you're doing a rebuild like this where you have a lot of small fiddly parts and you don't want to lose them. Because of the mesh setup, the solution can get easily in there doing its job, but you don't have the risk of losing parts into that big pea soup bat that the alcohol usually looks like by the time I'm done with the wash. So all these components are just going to be placed on the inside. And because the unit is held together with a really powerful spring, or a strong enough spring, I should say, it keeps them in place without any sort of issues. For the remainder of the parts here, I'm going to go ahead and utilize my ghetto version that I made a little while ago out of some plastic Dixie cups. It's like a little diving bell. So this here is perfect to just mount in the larger pieces like the suspension, or I should say the running gear parts. And the barrel could fit in there too. Pretty much straightforward. This one over here, this is the spare tire with those little pins in it. I'm going to go ahead and put this back in the spring one, just because of the added fragility of those pins, which may or may not even survive the process, but you know, we'll see what happens. This guy here will be re-rubber banded in place. Okay. Diving bell's all ready to go. Side skirts are not a problem. They're just going to be placed into that without any issues. And this leads us to the model itself. So this one here is a bit different compared to the other models in the OTR lineup, where all of them have been turreted vehicles of one flavor or another. And this is relevant because, as I frequently mention, these plastic models have a habit on floating. And if you're doing a solution bath like this, you want to have the thing submerged so that the solution gets to all areas of the paint finish in order to dissolve the paint thoroughly and more effortlessly. Normally, the way this is done is that you pop the turret off, I put in some heavy bits of equipment, and then this will weigh the model down so it clunks on the bottom of the bucket, and then the model can now go through its procedure. However, this one here, it's going to be a different story because it's a casemate. There's no exactly an easy way to get into the interior, so this is going to have to be done in a slightly different manner. So for this one, I'm going to have to pull a trick from the mob and give this model some cement galoshes, or in this case, brass and or steel galoshes. Regardless, it's going to have to be weighed down. So to do this, I'm going to use some rubber bands here. And I'm just going to put the rubber bands along the model like this. I'm not going to put them horizontally because of the frailness of these rails over here. These may or may not survive the stripping process, but you know, I want to see if I can at least salvage what I can. And once the rubber bands are on, I can go ahead then and just weigh the unit down with some bits of hardware. Let's see if this will work. I think that should do the trick. And it wouldn't be an OTR video without everyone's favorite cast member, yours and mine, the bucket of denatured alcohol. And as I customarily do in these videos, before I can give the model the dunk, I want to go over the court-ordered safety briefing. Yes, it is that time. So, in a nutshell, denatured alcohol is a serious substance. You don't want to mess around with it. You note I am wearing gloves. I usually wear gloves in these videos, but I specifically wear gloves when I'm dealing with this substance here because I don't want to get it on my skin. On top of that, you definitely don't want to get it in your eyes. You don't want to huff the fumes, and you most certainly don't want to drink it. On top of that, smoking around this stuff is a really, really bad idea. You definitely don't want to do that. And just take the proper safety precautions. Don't be a horse's ass, and the stuff here will treat you perfectly fine. So, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and pop the top. And go ahead and get the model ready for the dunk. As you can see, this stuff is pretty topped off still from the Sergeant Yorks, and with this model being its small stature, I'm pretty sure there's going to be more than enough solution here to do the job. So, here we go. Get one last good look of this thing with the current condition, because this guy here is about to take the dunk in 3, 2, 1, and down she goes. Okay. The diving bell's next. Followed by the little cage. As are the turtle side skirts. Now I'm going to quickly top the bucket, as this is the type of thing that will most definitely be kicked if placed in the shop. Alright, let me go ahead, set this aside, and we'll cut back in a period of time later to see exactly what happened to the model on the inside. It's been a few weeks since the last time I filmed this thing taking the dunk. I think it's been about 3.5, maybe 4 weeks at this point. Hard to tell, lost track of time, but regardless, I think it's safe to say that the thing has been in the solution now for a long enough period of time, so it's time to go ahead, pop the top, and get the thing thoroughly stripped down. So before I go ahead and put my respirator on, let me just go ahead and pop the lid. Quick glance, it doesn't appear that the paint is loosened or is bubbling or anything. However, I am quite confident that as soon as my stiff bristle brush here makes contact with the surface, the paint is just going to dislodge without any sort of issues. So I'm going to go ahead, get my respirator on, get my little sifting pan ready, and commence with the strip down. So really quick, as soon as I took the model out of the solution, yeah, you can see the paint blistering up. Oh yeah, this is going to come right off. Let's go ahead and start this. As we saw, the denatured alcohol bath made fairly short order of the paint that was on the surface. Like I touched upon before, the paint was a mix of X-Euro latex and possibly Tamiya. Regardless, the denatured alcohol was able to wipe it all out to the condition that we have here. So here are all of the major components, and I ran into some surprises during the strip down. In fact, it's funny actually it's part of the charm of revisiting these older builds, is that I get to remember things and when I come across certain items during the course of the build, and there's definitely something I remember, and involves that little row wheel right over there. So as you can see, one of these row wheels here has a little addition. During the construction of this build, I remember that one of the row wheels towards the end of production fell off the model and bounced off the Lost Partia, and obviously I was kind of irritated and very mad about that, because, you know, trying to scratch build a row wheel is basically impossible. So what I went ahead and did was I went ahead and took one of the spares and utilized it as one of the main row wheels. To do this, I actually had to fabricate, or closely fabricate as much as possible as my teenage self could at the time, a replacement hubcap. And all things considered, I think I did a pretty decent job, because even myself, upon looking at the model fully built, totally forgot about that this was something that I actually did. So you can see that the part is very rough. It's, you know, keep in mind, if I was doing this nowadays, this would be turned on the lathe, or, you know, 3D print something. But back then, you know, I took a nail and a washer, and I basically just cobbled together to the format that we see here. This is definitely not going to be recycled on this build, and this one's going to spend its days in the spare bin, as I am going to be making a mold of one of the fresh Tamiya Panzer III wheels that I have on another Panzer, or I should say Stug III kit, that's going to be used as a, you know, aid with this one over here. However, it is one interesting I do want to point out. Outside of the hubcap kerfuffle, the remainder of the wheels are in excellent shape. The sprocket and the idlers are also in excellent shape, as are the remainder of the tools that you can see here. The main armament has a slathering of thick red tube tester's glue smeared on in order to plug up the bodywork, the swudge, or I should say plug up the seam work, which was something that I did at the time, and very similar to how I do seam removal today, only with, you know, super glue. However, teenage John didn't realize that, oh yeah, after the glue's on, you're supposed to sand it down with some sandpaper. So that's something that's going to be taken care of as this build progresses. I'm just going to pick up where I left off, but other than that, everything seems to be okay, and a replacement is really not necessary. As for the model itself, currently in the bath are the side skirt panels and also the side skirt rails. I don't think they're going to be salvaged. I think I'm just going to go ahead and use the ones that are found on the fresh Tamiya one, because that one I'm probably going to build it without the side skirts. So since I have a fresh set on hand, I'm just going to go ahead and drop those on this guy over here and amputate the original ones completely outright. Outside of that, you can see that during the build, they had some kind of problems over here. I hit the side here with some really coarse sandpaper, putting in some really heavy gouges. I used that same sandpaper over here where that hatch would have been on the Panzer III tooling, and you do have to polish it down with some sandpaper. Well, the sandpaper I used was pretty rough. This one here, I didn't even do that. I could still see the remnants right there where the hatch is supposed to be glued on, if you're building as a Panzer III, of course. This side here has some scratching, of course. It's a model of its era, so I did that stupid, ridiculous cast texturing technique that I always mention in these videos. There was a horrible technique that was one time mentioned in Fine Scale Modeler. Don't do it. It's a abysmal technique. It doesn't look like cast texturing. It doesn't look like metal texturing. It just looks like you dropped your Dremel on the surface and dicked up your model kit, so don't do that. So that means this one here is going to have to go through some repair work. On the front armor over here, I can see I did the exact same bullcrap on these two sections, so this also needs to be repaired. As for alignment, they appear to be straight. I don't know. I have to take a second look at that. If these things are out of whack, I'm probably just going to amputate them outright and make clones of the Tamiya one and just cast two fresh ones and drop them in place. But we'll see how that pans out. Same thing here on the ducts. I hit them with some sandpaper for reasons that are unknown to me. So I'm just going to go ahead and deal with this as the build progresses. Outside of that, the model again is in, you know, pretty decent shape for what it is, or I should say with the starting condition. The smoke, or I should say the little smoke grenade launcher here is a little loose. That's going to be taken care of. The firing cables are still intact. I'm just going to leave them as is. You know, they're perfectly fine. If anything, I'm going to scratch build those on the other one, as, you know, that is common detail that I scratched, but only I'm not going to use string. I use wire on more contemporary builds, but regardless, same thing is going to be done. And the model does have several other added features, like some well lines, which appear to be a bit on the rough side, but, you know, we'll see how it pans out in refining those quite a bit. So there we go. So now you have a good baseline on the model. I will say, though, that on a plus side, the suspension is properly assembled. As you can see, the torsion bars all line up appropriately. That's great. And the same thing is true, yep, for the ones on the opposite side. This is where the Jagdpanther that I did recently definitely was one of the weaker aspects of that build. I had to go ahead and go through the motions on rebuilding all that. But for this one here, fortunately, that's just not going to be the case. So that's going to be a huge plus. The return rollers are firmly glued on in place, and fortunately they too are installed in a appropriate manner, so I'm not going to have to mess with them so much like I had to do, for instance, on the Joseph Stalin III old tank repair video. But so far that just seems like what the course of action is going to be for this one here. So alright, so now that you see what I'm up against, let's go ahead and have at it. While I was reviewing the model over further, I saw some things I'm going to have to replace, as well as also have to design. And starting with the lower hull, well, first I just want to mention I went ahead and took care of some body work on some of the areas. I took care of the seam that was found in this section over here. And I also went ahead and took care of some of the other seams that were present on some of the other locations, as well as also removing some glue fingerprints. But the one area that I'm going to have to completely amputate and replace is the front armor. Because that stupid tick mark thing that I mentioned earlier, trying to sand this down, basically it's just the juice isn't worth the squeeze. With all these bolts over here, trying to get the glue into these sections and sand around them is more or less not really something I want to do. So the front armor's got to go, and the same is also true for the one here on the top. It's really, really bad, as well as also on the two front armored sections. So for the ones on the front armored sections, I actually made a copy of the other Tamiya Stug III that I was working on, and I have cast resin replacements, so those are just going to drop directly in place. For the front armor, however, this is something I'm going to have to do a little bit different. In addition to that, I also went ahead and saw some other areas on this model that I was missing components on, so I went ahead and designed those up as well, and those are going to be found right here. This here is a new addition to the ECA 1/35 scale product line. It is a 3D printed set for the Panzer III or the Stug III, you know, either one, and it supplies you with the replacement sections of the front bolt-on armor, as well as a few other fittings. This here is a pre-production sample. It's made in this gray resin color, and I'm not really digging it for this type of application. The production ones are going to be just standard HD material, and also these are going to be listed on the ECA Shapeways store and can be found with the other 1/35 scale and smaller scale 3D printed replacement components that I've tooled up over the years. The link can be found in the video description listed below. Just to quickly interject here, this is post-production John talking, and I'm actually editing this months after the events that you just saw in the previous scene. Since the time in between, Shapeways no longer produces components in HD with this gray material. Now the components are produced in this orange flesh type material, and this material is far superior to the old material that you see in the video. All of the production units are going to be made out of that material as opposed to the gray stuff that you see here. With that out of the way, let's continue with the video. Basically, the armor here is designed to be a direct drop-in replacement for the ones found on the Tamiya model. And also found on the set are a couple crowbars. One is going to be needed for the model, the other one is just extra. So, you know, in case you can keep that for a rainy day. We also have here the receptacles for the cleaning staves, which are found on the back, as they are missing on this model over here. Sadly, I am missing one of the portions here. They did not print out properly, but on the production ones, this is going to be addressed, and you'll see some thumbnails popping up on what the revised part will look like. Regardless, the cup section is here and does have its welds integrally molded on, and that's really all there is to mention about that. But in order to get these components fitted to the model, I am going to have to do some very, very, very strategic sanding in order to just amputate the armor and the armor alone. So this is something that's going to have to be done, and I'll go ahead and walk you through the process. To remove the armor, this is actually going to be really, really tricky. You can use a file like this one over here and brute force it, but it's going to take a long time to do. Still doable, but you know, you have to really put forth some effort. Using a knife here to try to carefully pry apart the glue seams is another option, but it's one, very dangerous if you only know how many times I've cut myself from doing things like that. But also this too can cause some collateral damage where you can break the front armor plate, and that's something that you don't really want to cause any damage to. A Dremel with a high-speed removal bit is another one that can potentially be used, but again, a lot of risks are involved, so no matter which way you cut it, it is a very risky procedure. I'm going to try to basically do everything to see if I could go ahead and pull this off. Literally pull it off, and figuratively. So I have here my knife. I'm going to try to pry it open from here. The one time the red 2 glue actually bonded really well is in the one location where I really don't want it. So it's kind of ironic. Yep, and there goes some collateral damage right there. Yeah, that was something I did not want to do, but yeah, this is going to be one of those type of jobs. Okay, well, I'm going to just fast forward, figure out how I'm going to do this, and I'll meet you once this has already been taken care of. Good news is I was able to take care of the removal of the armor plates, and the way I did this was with all of the techniques I mentioned before, but primarily I used the Dremel with the high-speed removal bit, and I carefully went ahead and just milled away a layer of thin plastic until finally I got to a certain point, to which then I switched over to the file, and I was able to do the rest. Sadly, it's one of those things I can't really get on camera because, you know, I kind of have to have the model close into me so that I have really good control with the Dremel, and it's not really good or very easy to get that on film. So just do trust me on this one. And this leads us now to the upper hull section. As I mentioned before, this area is going to receive quite a bulk of revision. So the front armor sections, right now this one looks like it took an impact. This is going to be completely removed, as is the one on this side, because again, thanks to that stupid Dremel nonsense that I did earlier, these are going to be 1086. I'm going to be replacing them with a fresh set of cast rest ones like I mentioned before. In addition to that, I also went ahead and made copies of the smoke grenade launchers. These ones here are beat halfway to death. Not really salvageable, so I'm just going to amputate them completely and replace them with the fresh ones. Under these locations over here, I kind of have to get in here to sand down the putty, or I should say the super glue that I added to get rid of that, again, that stupid tick marks, but at least on this, it's a nice flat plate, and I have ample room to go in here with the sandpaper to delete. The area on the side here, these have that technique as well, and with the smoke grenade launchers removed, I'll be able to get better access to these areas. Something else I've been doing off camera is revising the well beads. I've been just going over these with a needle file like I have over here, just to get rid of the clunk left over from the Dremel procedure, and it's been making, or I should say it's been doing a good job in refining the well beads and making them more to scale. Without further ado though, it's time to focus on the removal of the armor. And there we go. Easy peasy. Let's go ahead and get the remainder of the front section revised. As you can see, the sandpaper did a phenomenal job with dealing with the surfaces on the fighting compartment, making sure that they're all nice and smooth now, and way more presentable compared to the way we had it before. The front section got cleaned up pretty well. The only thing that remains to be done with the sandpaper is to hit the air intakes over here, as they have those stupid tick marks as well. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that off camera, and then when I come back to the fighting compartment, I'm going to start etching some new welds in place, just because the original ones that were molded on the kit were eliminated with the original Dremel marks and also with the bodywork. But the difference, though, is between then and now is that now I have better techniques on how to re-add the welds that were once destroyed. So on this portion of the model, I went ahead and took care of the welds off camera. Ironically, I actually resculpted the welds using the same technique that I did originally that botched the welds up. It's kind of funny how that works. It's the same method. The only thing that's a little different is my technique and my hands are a little bit more precise compared to where they were all those years ago. So in order to do this, I use a Dremel with a small micro drill bit. This is from the same vendor that I always reference in these videos and can be found in the video description listed below. On the bit itself, this is actually a broken bit, and I always found that the broken bits actually do a pretty decent job with etching the weld beads as opposed to using a fresh one. You can still use a fresh one, but the broken bits actually do the job pretty well as well. So I'm going to go ahead and show exactly how it's done. You want to go at a slow speed, and I'm just going to go ahead and etch these things in. And that's half the equation. So now that they've been etched, the next thing I want to do is remove the extra bit of plastic that puddled up around all of the notches. And that's going to be utilizing a knife. You can also utilize a needle file for the exact same procedure. Just depends on whichever one you have on hand, whichever one you feel more comfortable with. But if you do things right, both methods should take you to the same results. And basically just run it up and down the surface. And this will have the effect of cleaning up the welds and refining them. There you have it. Hopefully it comes out on camera, but this will be much more appreciated and noticeable after the model gets painted and once that panel line accent goes in there. So I think that's the end of the sanding that's required for now. From this point, I'm going to actually remount on the armor, but before I do that, I do want to plug up these holes here with putty. They are quite large, and I believe they're in the wrong location, so I'm going to go ahead and take care of them at this point. With the armor reinstalled, it's now time to get the upper and lower hulls ready for remounting. And the one thing I am going to do before I go ahead and do that is take care of a bug found on the Tamiya kit. And if you've watched my other Tamiya videos, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. On the bottom portion here of the fighting compartment, the sponsons are absent on this model. This is something that is present on a large number of the older generation Tamiya kits for reasons that I never was able to understand, but it's always something that just always irked me. Now, you could go ahead and build it out of the box and be okay with it, more or less, but I'm just going to go ahead and take care of it. It's one of those things that, you know, just makes the build better, and it does make me feel better about the build overall. So to do this, I'm going to have to rebuild the sections here with some styrene. Now, you can't just glue a section of plastic on the inner portion here of the sponson and call it a day. I mean, I am going to be doing that, but if you look at the model sideways, you'll see that there's a small gap. Let me just go ahead and properly line it up. You'll see that there's a very small gap in between the upper hull and the lower hull, and this is something that needs to be addressed, and that piece of plastic on the top here is just not going to be able to fill that area in, or at least fill it in completely. So I'm actually going to glue a Plastruct strip to each of these sides here, in addition to gluing some styrene strips on the inside portion of the fighting compartment. This should make up the difference, and when the model is glued together, it will be completely solid through and through. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark with a pencil exactly where the extenders need to go. This is crucial because if the extenders are not in the right place, your fit is not going to align properly. That doesn't really help anybody. So to do this, you just simply put the upper and lower hulls together as you would if you were gluing it together. Then just put a couple little ticks with the pencil on either side. Now that the areas have been marked, go ahead, take my strips of plastic, cut them to length, and glue them in place. When gluing in place, you want to make sure that the strip is as flush as possible to the side hull over here. For reasons that should be fairly obvious. Let the glues fully set. If there is a little bit of plastic coming out from the edge, just polish that down with some sandpaper and you should be good to go. I'll also add another smear of glue just to the top recess to act as a filler, and that way I could blend the seam in and address that at this time. Once the upper hull gets fitted, you're not exactly going to get a whole lot of access to this location over here, specifically with this one having the return rollers already in place. Which is why if you're doing a procedure like this, you always do not want to have the suspension mounted. And furthermore, it's stuff like this is why I always say you want to add the running gear at the very tail end of the build after everything is already painted and weathered, because it makes the assembly easier and also makes painting of these components much, much easier. Trying to get in here and paint those rubber tires on the inner portions, it's going to be a bit of a tall order. Okay, so that takes care of that, and now we're going to go ahead and start the fabrication of the sponsons. I'm going to utilize two bits of material to do this. I have a little bit of angle, and I believe this is a 1/4 inch, no, it's probably a little bit thicker or wider than a 1/4 inch piece of Plastruct plastic, and this is obviously a little strip right here, and this is going to be used for the bulk of the spots and work. In fact, it's basically the perfect size. And the angle is going to be used to act as a brace and just prevent the part from sinking in during installation, and helps with the alignment. So I'm just going to go ahead and clip 2 sections of angle. They don't have to be that long. You know, you don't have to have them run across the entire span here of the compartment interior. Just a quick little rough cut section should be suffice. But I will make them evenly cut because, well, why not? For this guy here, it's going to be a little bit more precise, so this one I'm just going to dry fit it and mark it with a pencil. As you can see, it's already shaping up to be pretty good. So from here, I'm going to take the angle, I'm actually going to glue it to the strip. And you want to make sure that it's nice and lined up. Help to deburr it, that would be nice. I'm using the table here as a alignment jig. Make sure it's nice and flush. Do the same thing with the other. Also help if it was in the center. Okay, at that point there, it's time for installation onto the model. If it's interfering with the shape of the hut, you could just go ahead and trim accordingly. So after test fitting it, I realized that the strip wasn't thick enough and there was still a gap that was present. In order to take care of this, I just doubled up the layers here. So I cut 2 more strips the same length, glued them on top of the new ones, and I added some super glue on the sides that I'm waiting to dry so I could polish it down, taking care of the bodywork like I did before. After that, the piece should be ready to go, and if I go ahead and mate up the upper and lower hull sections, it's always easier said than done, but there you go. You can see how it blends in and connects to each other much better, and that infernal hole is now completely removed. Before I go ahead and do the bodywork, another thing I'm going to revise are the rear toe shackles that we have here on the back. The kit originally had these parts, as we saw before. They were horribly botched when I first built the model, and they didn't really survive the paint stripping process. I went ahead and made molds of the other Tamiya Stug III that I was working on, and I was able to cast replacements. So, in order to mount the replacements on, the shards of the old ones need to go. I got the dremel over here with the same bit that I did for the welding procedure. I'm going to use that to just delete and eat out the material that's here from the old remnants. With these areas cleaned out, I should be able to start the reconstruction of this area back here. One of the other areas I got to revise is the mount for the main pack, and the kit just has this block that gets glued on in place. However, somehow as a kid I bungled this up pretty badly, and the fit is something that really needs to be addressed, otherwise it's just not going to sit right. So I'm going to go ahead and try to see if I could polish things down. This I'm just going to hit with some sandpaper, smooth off, get rid of all those chunky sections of glue. On the hull here, I'm probably going to run a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit just to lightly prep the surface, make it nice and square, so again, the piece could be remounted in a way that's much more appropriate. With this fella now squared away, it's time to focus on the remainder of the armament. This is the last bit of equipment that's really preventing me from getting the upper and lower hull sections remounted. On other vehicles, this wouldn't be a problem. I could go ahead and just, mount the upper and lower, and then I can progress from there. However, on a Stug, this is definitely not the case. Even with the way the kit is designed, the Tamiya kit wants you to go ahead, install the upper and lower, install the armament, and then drop the roof panel in place. This is because you're not going to be able to get access to these locations once the upper and lower hulls are assembled, and also once the roof is fitted in place. Well, with this example over here, I'm going to have to be a little bit more creative because the roof is not going anywhere and I'm not causing any serious damage to this, so I'm going to need to work around it. To work around it, the way I'm going to go through the motions is I'm going to first install the trunnion system. With the trunnion in place, I can then secure on the upper, and then theoretically, I've been messing with this off camera, I should be able to get the main armament to slip in and lock into place at that time. So we're going to see if that's going to be viable. Outside of that, there's no real other easy way to go about it. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to clean up these two sections over here. The rotor, or I should say the trunnion section, is in pretty decent shape. There's really nothing much going on over here, but I do want to polish up just some of the glued areas, making it look a little bit more refined. The other thing I want to do is with the clip. As you can see, the clip is one of those things that where it's designed where once it's plugged in place, you're not going to be able to pull it out. Well, obviously, it was pulled out, and you can see that the piece has a little bit of deformation to it, and that's probably going to cause the piece to wiggle loose when installed in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take a piece of plastic like this and basically just add to this section over here, widening it out slightly just so it could fit into the area in a much better and stronger manner. the model was new, obviously this wouldn't be a topic of conversation, and I could just go through the motions. On the mantlet area, there are some seams I want to contend with right here. I want to polish that down. And I also want to refine some of the weld beads that I added when I first built the model. After that, the entire unit's probably going to be primed, as well as this intersection here will be primed with flat black, and maybe even I'll go in here with some dunkelgelb, because like I stated in the other Stug videos, once this unit is assembled, there's a lot of obstacles in the way over here, and this will prevent paint from getting into the necessary locations, and it will just cause, you know, just some multitude of problems. So this is true for all Stugs. If you're building a vehicle like this, you might want, it would be great to pre-prime and paint this area with the base coat prior to final assembly. You'll thank me in the long run. Okay, so the mantlet's all taken care of now. Before I go ahead and get this into prime along with the other locations, I want to finish off the main tube. So this here was, like I mentioned before, I glued it together when I was a kid. And I just slattered a lot of Tester's red tube to plug up the seam, but I never sanded it down. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and pick up where I left off with some sandpaper and a needle file. So the barrel cleaned up really nicely, but before I go ahead and can install it, I do want to do some final prepping. I'm going to drill a hole in the back section, so now I'm going to insert a piece of wire, and then I'm going to drill a corresponding hole in the mantlet, and that's how it's going to plug in place. Trying to re-glue it on with the current configuration, it's just not going to work. It's too loose, there's no support, and the thing's just going to end up looking really bad. So don't do that. When you have a situation like this, the best way to do this is with a metal rod. To do that, I am going to go ahead and need to drill a hole dead center in this portion over here, and I'm going to go ahead and chisel that away, or the remnants away, I should say, with this needle file. Just a few passes, really all that's required. Okay, that's drilled out. From this point here, I'm going to drill the hole dead center, and I'm actually going to use the lathe just for the simple reason that I could drill it totally dead center. If you do not have a lathe, you could do the same thing with a pin vise or with a dremel. You just have to be a little bit more careful with it, but it could still be done regardless. I have done that in the past, but since I have the tooling, I might as well go ahead and use it. I'm not going to get that on camera, really no point. You've seen me use the lathe on a plethora of other of these OTR videos, so let's just cut across to when that's already been taken care of, and I've already drilled a hole into this guy over here. So jumping forward, you can see the same components now, but primed in flat black. Here's the mount itself. Cleaned up pretty well, as did the barrel. You'll notice that I primed this off of the component because this was done just to verify if the seams were thoroughly removed. If I went ahead and installed it in place and primed it and found some hidden surprises, well then I could have taken care of the seam work, but it would have been a little bit more complicated when attached to the mantlet itself. So that's why I went ahead and took care of it off the part, but as you can see, the seam work is completely flawless and the piece polished extremely well. And again, I didn't have to add any sort of additive. What was on the surface from when I added as a kid was simply just utilized to polish it down to the way I have it now. On the mantlet itself, you can see all the revisions that have been made, like the addition of the perforations found on the retention ring, and you can also see the cut line that was carved. On the real one, this would be two parts, and so there would be this natural seam in this section over here. This is found on the kit. However, with the way the model was built, I guess some glue seeped out from those sections over there, and it basically acted as a filler, deleting the seam, which is ironic because of all the places where seams need to be removed. That is not one of them. So that's why I went ahead and recarved it in with the method that I showed. From this point, these components here are going to get painted. Not so much the mount, but the rear section here of the mantlet is going to be painted with its Dunkelgelb as a prelim base. And also this area here is going to be primed for the same reasons that I mentioned with the mount, or with the mantlet. In addition to being primed in flat black, I am also going to brush on some Dunkelgelb in this section over here for, again, the exact same reasons. On the topic of pre-prime work, same is going to be done with the inside area here of the rear, as well as also this area. This is something that it's one of those locations where it's not visible, but it is visible, and it's visible enough to see with your eye, but it's not visible enough for the paint to get in there when you're doing the application. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-prime these at this time as well. It's going to be a lot easier to do that before everything is assembled as opposed to afterwards. So might as well take the advantage at this point. So after a few moments in the sun, here are the pieces back with both the primer and the base coat added. For the primer, I went with just some Tamiya flat black. I went ahead and added the airbrush, and the reason why the airbrush was used instead of just spray paint was because I had the little bit of paint left over in the bottle. Might as well put it to good use. And the second thing is it gives me a bit more precision on this type of application as opposed to spray paint, which would tend to give me a little bit of overspray. And for this model here, you know, the less coats of paint, the better. And, you know, it's just going to streamline things later on towards the end of the build. Regardless, here's what the final outcome looks like. This is, by the way, the exact same paint I am going to be painting the model with. I'm talking about the Dunkelgelb specifically as the video progresses, but, you know, here's what it looks like right now. Let's go ahead and move these masks out of the way. And there we have it. I also went ahead and added the paint to the bottom sections for the same reasons that I mentioned before. And this fella here is ready for the next step. On the lower, I just basically just primed and did the same base coat to the under areas. And now that's one less thing I have to worry about. Same was also done, but just the base coat wise to the rear exhaust manifold. And again, this is going to be mounted shortly after the upper and lower hulls are remounted together. Before I go ahead and get the upper and lower hulls fitted, the very last thing I'm going to be doing to the upper hull involves the visor. With the way the kit is designed, it is a hollow bit of tooling, so you get to see, you know, into the interior, or lack thereof. But regardless, on most other kits out there, there's just a backing to the periscope. You just go in there and paint it with some gloss black, and now you have your prism detailing. But for this model here, because it's open, one trick that I like to do is to add a little bit of clear plastic to the inside portion of the model to act as, well, panzer glass. This is a nice little tip to add to your Tamiya Stug IIIs, and it's one I also mentioned in the other Stug III video that I'm going to be posting shortly around the time this video drops. Before I can go ahead and do that, the first thing I do want to have done is with a paintbrush, I painted the inner recesses here of the visor with the Dunkelgelb. As soon as the paint is dry, I can then go ahead and install the clear plastic from the inside. This has to be done because it will make painting a much easier ordeal, as you don't want to get overspraying here with the airbrush, and also trying to paint that section with the clear plastic in place is a bit problematic. So go ahead, paint it first, let it dry, then go ahead, install the clear plastic, which I'll show what that looks like momentarily. With the paint fully set, time to make the panzer glass. Here I have some clear plastic. This is just from a blister pack of one flavor or another. The blister packs make excellent usage on modeling projects, specifically if you're going to use them for clear plastic, or I should say clear components, because they are very easy to work with, and the best part is they are free. So I just simply cut them up, like the way you see here. Now I have my clear styrene. I'm just going to trim it to shape. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue it to the inside portion here of the front armor section. Just going to trim it more to shape. Okay, now it's time to glue it on. Normally, I don't use super glue for gluing on clear plastic parts because of the fog effect that super glue does have. And generally, I use white glue for this application. However, for this one here, I think I am going to use a very tiny finite amount of super glue, because if this piece ever gets old and pops off, as white glue can potentially do, you know, that's going to be a bit of a problem when it's rattling around the inside of the model. Specifically on this one, since it's not a turreted tank, once it's sealed up, it's sealed up. So I think I might just use a small little drop of super glue, as that will hold a lot better, and it'll just give me a little better peace of mind. Also, because of how large I cut the piece, there's some surface areas here where I can add the glue, and even if it does gas up slightly, it shouldn't cause any problems with the Panzer glass itself. So I put 2 tiny little drops over there on the top. Make sure that the plastic is clear of any debris. And fit the piece in place. This time I'm just going to set the thing aside and let the glues fully set. And I'm letting them set so that they are in the open air. This is done to mitigate as much as possible any sort of potential gas that can happen from the CA setting. If you are in a confined space, that's when you get a lot of that white gassy type foggy stuff that happens with super glue. But if the piece is open to the open air, it's much more mitigated. And for good measure, I might as well use a little dab of white glue right here on the bottom recess, right over there, just to give the part a little bit extra support. Like so. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead, let the stuff dry, and then we could start with the remounting process. And after a little bit of elbow grease and not a whole lot of extra parts later, here we have the model fully ready for painting. Starting with the model itself, you can see that the 3D printed armor panels have been fitted in place. The armor is designed to utilize the kit Tamiya No-Tech Light right over here. This, of course, is a resin copy. The original one just was not going to be suitable. Moving up, you can see the smoke grenade launchers. These are the cast resin copies of the Tamiya one. One procedure that I did was I added the firing cables, which is something that I always add on these models. It's one I even added originally, but in a slightly different format. Rather than using string, I use thin floor wire these days, and the hole is now in the appropriate location as opposed to the way I had it originally. On the top portion over here, you can see the center strut. This was a piece that I actually neglected to install all of those years ago, and so on this one here, I finally was able to correct that, and I made a copy of the one from my other Tamiya model, cast one resin, and dropped it in place. This will be able to be painted and primed along with the remainder of the model without any problems. On the back portion here, you can see the replacement antenna bases. These are, again, copies of the Tamiya one. The original ones were in the wrong location, and they were even swapped. They are not a symmetrical part. One is bigger than the other. I didn't really get that drift back then, so the original ones are toast, and the new ones have been added, and, you know, it basically completes the look of the model. Or, I should say, makes it look more appropriate compared to the way we had it earlier. On this section over here, you can see I drilled two small little holes onto the back. This is actually for me to visually line up the spare track rack that will be recycled and remounted in place. Obviously, I cannot add that to the model this time because I need to paint and weather the track first. Some people out there, they like to, you know, glue the track in one piece and try to paint it. Again, crazy idea. That doesn't really, it's just a terrible way to do it. In my opinion, you're going to get missed paint areas. Unless you're going to get one of those looks where you want to have the tracks overpainted on top of the rest of the model. In that case, yeah, that makes sense actually. But if you're going to not do that, then installing the spare tracks at this time is pretty foolish in my opinion. Moving further, you can see I went ahead and remounted the little U-shackles. Those are the original ones. I was able to recycle them, clean them up, and use them. Here you get to see the cleaning stave mounts. This here is the new 3D printed one. This one here, it's a mix of the 3D printed one, and also I fabricated a new bracket out of thin aluminum. The top portion of the bracket miraculously survived the print. I saw it stuck on the bottom portion of the mounting plate right over here on this section, so I'm like, hey, why not? So I carefully popped it off with an X-Acto, and it just dropped right onto the aluminum one without any sort of problems. And so you get some nice detailing here, and, you know, it fills in the rest of the look. On this model here, I am not going to add the stave detailing. I'm going to leave it in its empty condition, so, you know, basically we'll be able to do the job in this format. Also on this area, you can see I went ahead and deleted the original lift hooks, and I replace them with two resin copies. The original ones were not in the correct location, if memory serves, and so I went ahead and adjusted it accordingly, so now it's more appropriate. Further back, I went ahead and did a little bit of body work over here. I must have added a little bit too much red tube glue because it had a little sinkhole, and it was like a perfect round divot, and just didn't really look all that great, so I put a little smear of red putty on there, polished it down to the look that you see here. It'll look much better once fully painted. On the spare wheel mounts, one of them here was broken, so I replaced it with a piece of wire. This is not going to be seen once the wheel gets installed in place, but it does make mounting of the spare wheel a much easier affair. On down, we have the reinstallation of the exhaust manifold, as well as also I went ahead and casted and mounted on the new replacement toe shackles. One of them was original, if you saw earlier in the video, however, just mishaps being what they are, the piece cracked off on me when I was, I believe, chipping away some glue on some location, so I just simply 1086 and replaced it with a fresh resin cast one. Once it's fully painted, it'll blend right in with the remainder of the new details. Of course, unlike the other, well, it's getting a little ahead of myself, on my other Tamiya Stug III, I did not make it or render it with the shirts in place, so I went ahead and used it on this one. As we saw earlier on in the video, the Schürzen did not survive the paint stripping process, and since I had a brand new set of Schürzen on hand, spare from the other model, no point leaving this languish away in the spare bin, so I simply just used it on this model. The mounts went on absolutely perfectly. I did have to clean up some slight areas where the original ones were. Fortunately, this was very easily done. Removed the necessary clunk, and then the new struts were fitted in place. I then mounted on the side struts that we have right here, and they went on without any sort of problems. Took my time with it, made sure that the alignment was where it needed to be, and presto, I was good to go. On the Schürzen itself, you'll notice that I went ahead and pre-glued on the mounts. This is something that's a bit different compared to some of the other Tamiya kits out there or other vehicles with the Schürzen. On most other models, you usually glue these sections to the fender itself, and then when the Schürzen gets added at the end, it all just lines up. However, on those builds, they usually have indication points found on the side skirt, or I should say the tin work area, so that the units can properly line up. On the Stug III here, that's just not the case, so it's best to mount them to the Schürzen, and then once everything is painted, you just mount it on in one assembly. So this is something that I'm going to be touching upon as the video goes on, more, of course, after everything is painted and weathered. These are the types of equipment that it will be very foolhardy to add at this time before the thing even slides off into paint. That's just crazy. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and paint everything separately off the model and then install it during final assembly. On the Schürzen itself, one other thing I do want to mention with the Tamiya kit is that there are some knockout marks found on the inner sections of the armor, and these are extremely easily polished away just with some fine sandpaper. I didn't even have to add any sort of glue or red putty or anything along those lines in order to polish them away. Just a little bit of elbow grease was all that was required, and the Schürzens are all nice and polished down. On a similar note, this takes us to the MG shield right here. This is the original one. Simply cleaned it up. On the inside, there are also some knockout marks, and I went ahead and addressed these with a little smear of red putty and a little bit of sanding. This is going to be painted and weathered off the model, and then, of course, final assembly, it's going to be fitted in place into its permanent location. And that's all there is to mention about that. The last thing I am going to do before this thing slides off into paint is I'm going to mask up the visor section. As I showed before, there is clear plastic on the inside, and it'll be really anticlimactic to go through all of that only to get it covered up in paint. So I'm going to take some paper napkin, bend into a, or fold it into a nice little like pocket, and just wedge it into this area here of the visor, which is going to seal it off. This is why, by the way, if you notice, the visor has already been pre-primed and pre-painted prior to this work here, so that when I yank the mask off after everything is painted, nothing will stick out and it'll all just blend in absolutely seamlessly. To start with the paint work, like I always mention in these videos, the model needs to be primed, and for the primer, I'm going to utilize my tried and true method, which is the use of nothing more than El Cheapo flat black spray paint. A lot of people out there, you know, this, again, painting is one of those things where you ask 5 different people, you will get 5 different answers. But the one thing we all pretty much agree upon is there needs to be some kind of a primer on the surface of the model just to help with the paint, and it just leads for a better end result. Some people out there use a dedicated model primer. Other people will use just like a bottle of Tamiya, you know, flat black, or, you know, whatever color they have. Or they'll even have different type of colors. Gray, I've seen black, I've seen greens. There's a lot, you know, again, so many options out there. Me, El Cheapo can of flat black works like a charm. This stuff is really, really affordable, and it is readily available. So both of those are really, really handy. Specifically, if you are like me and you do a lot of volume of models, you really want to, you know, save money wherever you can. You know, the more money you save, the more kits you can buy. So, with that, the spray paint will be utilized on this model, as I already touched upon on several of the other components before. But from this point onward, the whole thing will slide off into paint. Once it gets its base coat, once it gets its primer coat, then I'll be able to add the base coat of Dunkelgelb. One last thing I did want to mention involves the road wheels. So as you can see here, you see the original road wheels that were on the model originally, and they've been stripped and are ready for painting. The ones down here are cast resin replacements. One of the wheels was straight up missing when I first started the build, and the other one was a repair, an old repair, but a repair nonetheless. And here's that road wheel right here. This was cobbled together. Looks like I took one of the spare wheels from the rear portion of the vehicle, and I went ahead and fabricated a new hubcap out of a little bit of metal, either a nail and a washer or what have you, and that was what was utilized to get the model back on its wheels. This did the job back then, but we could put this one out to pasture for now. The new wheels have been casted from the Tamiya one that I used as a donor, and these are the replacements. You can see the wheels right here. Once they are fully painted and weathered, they will blend in absolutely seamlessly with the remainder of the wheels, and you'll never be able to tell which one's which. And the other thing I do want to mention is you'll notice that these ones here have not been assembled, and again, I cannot stress this enough, when you're working on any tank model, doesn't matter the scale, it doesn't matter the make or the medium, it's always best to paint and weather and prime the wheels before not only being assembled, but also being fitted to the vehicle. There are so many people out there that when the tank is ready for painting, it has the full suspension on, and that is just completely crazy. I just don't understand how people could think that's a viable idea, because you will not be able to get paint into all the recesses. In fact, even with this one here, getting paint into these sections here is going to be very, 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 very hard, and I have to be very proactive on the paint application and make sure it's not something that's going to be too thick or chunky or anything along those lines because of these tight recesses. And that is with these wheels off of the model. With the wheels glued on the model, it almost becomes impossible. It's bad enough I have to deal with that with the return rollers over here, and this is going to be another area where I'm going to have to pay a lot of attention to and really stay on the ball with just painting everything with the primer, the base, and then, even worse, trying to get in there with a paintbrush to paint all the rubber tires. And unlike a lot of people out there, when I paint my rubber tires, I am thorough. I mean, I paint the backs, I paint the insides on both sides, and I also paint the remaining areas that are visible. So doing that, if the wheels are assembled and mounted to the model, becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible. And then if you have vehicles like a Panther or a Tiger, good luck getting the paint on that. I seriously do not know how the hell people can pull that off, let alone paint the track, because they put the track on at that time too. Completely ridiculous. Don't do that. That's just nonsense. So on these ones over here, they are going to be primed and painted off the model. I'm going to quickly go ahead, paint them, do the rubber work, and then at the very tail end, they get glued together and get fitted to the model. These ones here, it's going to be a little bit more complex with the paintwork, but I should be able to do it. Even though that they are not glued on or glued together, I am still able to get the paint on in the appropriate locations, but it's not nearly as easy as when the pieces are off and unassembled, like the ones you see there. And all of those other previous steps and procedures were to get to the point where we're at right now, which is getting the model in its paint. So the model itself, as well as all of its accessories, have been primed with flat black. Here you get to see the end result of the primer work. As you can see, it is much more cleaned up compared to the way we had it earlier. All those tick marks are gone, and you can see how those new 3D printed components look now that they are in a single color. And if you couldn't already tell from the sound of the crow in the background, as well as the breeze running through the trees, I am indeed filming this outdoors. As I often mention in these videos, whenever weather can permit, it is always a pleasant experience to paint your models outside. For a multitude of reasons. One, it's just, well, pleasant to be outside, specifically in the warm summer months. Two, because of the time of year this is, the paint will dry very, very quickly onto the model surface. And three, it prevents any sort of, well, let's just say it makes the shop a lot cleaner in the terms of, there's no big cloud of paint that needs to settle after the airbrushing operation. Unless there's a quick thunderstorm that's going to roll on in, which I don't think that's going to be the case right now. It's just very pleasant to paint outdoors in general. So, with the model, the accessories all painted, or I should say primed, we're now ready for the base coat. One other thing I do want to mention about the primer involves the grills over here. Even though the entire model was spray painted with flat black, as I would have predicted, the paint did not fully get into these areas over here of the grille work because of the fine confines that we do have. So after the paint was applied and was thoroughly set, with some Tamiya flat black and a paintbrush, I went ahead and applied it into the inner grille areas over there, making sure that, again, every area is coated with the flat black, and this will again be beneficial for the base coat, because if the spray paint wasn't going to get in here, I'm pretty sure the airbrushed base coat is also going to have similar issues. So it's best to go ahead and take care of that at that time. For the base coat, this model is going to be painted in all dunkelgelb for the base, and then the camouflage pattern gets applied afterwards. Of course, the base coat and the camo is going to be done both with the airbrush, and you'll see that momentarily. While on the topic of the base coat, the model here is going to be painted with a base of dunkelgelb, and this is going to be, of course, applied with the airbrush. Then the subsequent camouflage pattern and weathering will be applied after the fact. For the actual color itself, I have this color right over here. This is my mix of dunkelgelb. This is my tried and true method of using exterior flat latex house paint. And, you know, this is a staple on this channel on my German builds and can be seen on all of my yellow builds from vehicles in 1/6 scale, 1/16 scale, 135, 148, and if I ever did anything in 172 or 144, you bet it's going to be painted with that same paint. It seems like lately this, by the way, has been a point of controversy for some people out there on some of my recent videos, which is not entirely surprising. Part of the reason why I never really showed my painting techniques when I first started this channel, and for the number of years that followed, was because I figured I'm going to show how I paint the models, and then I'm going to have some idiot come out of the woodwork trying to play gatekeeper, telling me I'm doing it wrong, I'm an idiot, you know, I'm a fool, blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, I guarantee you the idiot either has no content on his channel, or if he does have content, my work is better than his, which is really funny. And not to toot my own horn or nothing, but more often than not, that has always been the case. But the reason why I use the exterior latex is very, very simple. First, it is with cost. Okay, when you build a lot of models like I do, and when you build the quantity and scale as I do, those little bottles of Tamiya, and even worse if you use those ooh la la luxury brands, is going to be elevated. So meanwhile, I could just go to the Home Depot with my mix of my color swatch of dunkelgelb. I get this thing here for about $20, $25, maybe $30. Meanwhile, you compare that to a bottle of Tamiya, which is about $4 a bottle, give or take, and it's a little cheaper online, but with shipping and everything, you're roughly paying about $4 a bottle. So when you take that price and you factor it in, for the price of 1 gallon, that gets me about 7 bottles of Tamiya, and I guarantee you I could paint way more models and bigger scale models with this as opposed to 7 bottles of Tamiya. So with the cost aside, because I mean the cost is one thing, but if the quality of the model sucks, then it doesn't matter how expensive or cheap the paint is. But I am more than content with the quality of work that I get from utilizing this painting method, and so do my customers for that matter. So if you think you're gonna make me change my mind and change my methods because you want me to use the paints you use, you could go and pound sand, and honestly you can fuck right off, because I'm not changing anything. And again, it's always funny when I have people telling me, wow, your models look so great, how do you paint them? Here's how I paint them. No, you're doing it wrong. It's welcome to the internet, you know. You're always going to run into an idiot occasionally, and poof, I've ran into several on this channel over the time. Most of the people have been awesome though. If you're watching this, chances are really good you're one of the cool ones. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that an idiot falls out of the tree every so often. So with that quick little rant out of the way, let's go ahead and get the paint ready for application. So the paint here has already been diluted, and to dilute my paint, this again, another thing that causes a little bit of controversy. Some people out there, they'll use a alcohol-based product or some kind of a dedicated model thinner type product, and which will work. I'm not, saying it's snake oil or nothing, but for me, low tech is best tech, and I just use tap water. That's all, just some tap water. I add the tap water to the mix here, and I stir it in. The house paint is on the thicker side, so when you are getting it ready for application with a brush or even with an airbrush, you do want to add the water to it just to thin it out. And this is something that's got to be done by feel, and once you get the hang of it and you know what your airbrush likes, you'll be able to just eyeball it and get the ratio every single time. So that's it for the chit-chatting for now. Let me go ahead, fill this thing up with paint, throw on my respirator here, and let's go ahead and get this thing painted. Okay, so that's the first coat out of the way. Now I'm just going to go ahead, set this thing aside, let the paint thoroughly dry. Once the paint is thoroughly dry, I could go ahead and hit it with the second coat, which will definitely start filling in and giving the area more opacity. Also, you'll notice that when I'm painting, I like to start with the crevices first. Okay, you start with the crevices, and then I like to work out from there. So you'll see I will do the edging, and then I'll start moving my way to the middle portions of the panel. This is just something that I always gravitated towards because the crevices are the areas that are the hardest to hit. So by adding the paint there first, you're focusing on that as opposed to hitting everything with a once-over and then having to try to go into the crevices with the spray. This can have the effect of adding a little too much paint in one location and can lead to drips. So that is something you want to avoid. Again, with the weather that I'm filming in right now, this shouldn't take too long for the paint to start drying on me. So set this thing aside, which by the way is another positive with the exterior latex. It dries really, really quick. So I'm just going to go ahead and carefully hold it by the torsion bars, the axles, and carefully set this thing down. And to quote the line from the Road Warrior,
just walk away.
While the paint is drying, you can see the road wheels over here with their first coat, and this circles back to why I stated before about the use of flat black as a primer. So one, you need the primer on the surface because regardless of the type of paint you use, I'm using latex, but if you use acrylic or enamels, you will still need some sort of a primer coat just so that the paint sticks better. But also, when you apply the paint in a thin down format, you can get the effects like you have here. It kind of looks like that the wheels are already weathered, and that's because the black is poking through certain areas of the paint. You do have control over the opacity. If I go over with a coat or two more of the Dunkelgelb, it will become a lot more yellower compared to having the look that we have here. But again, this is something that the builder can actually, learn to manipulate and work with their build. So if you're painting, factor that in mind, regardless of the type of paints you use. And as I stated before, painting a model is the type of thing where if you ask 4 different people, you will get 4 different answers, and really no answer is more correct or incorrect compared to the last one. At the end of the day, whatever works and what you're comfortable with is the way to roll. You're watching this video right now and seeing how I do it, and well, here it is, laid out right there in front of you. So, with my TED Talk out of the way, I'm just going to go ahead and let this stuff dry even further, and then I can continue with the remainder of the paint application. With the base coat applied, it's now time to add the camouflage. And for the camouflage on this one here, I'm going to actually recycle the same camo pattern that I originally had on this model when it was first built, only now I'm going to be utilizing more modern paints, airbrushing, and other sorts of weathering techniques. It's one of those things, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's a very interesting paint pattern, and it's one's based on a real vehicle. I originally got the idea from, well, my Stug III book, from Squadron Signal, and of course we have the nice centerfold right here with the beautiful illustrations, and there's the one that caught my attention. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the exact same camouflage pattern that, again, it originally had. For this pattern, this is something that's a bit different and unique compared to the other camouflage patterns that I've touched upon in the past. On those other builds, I always say when it comes to a camouflage pattern, I like to apply them in an organic manner where I just take the airbrush and I just apply you know, on the fly. I don't pre-draw anything or nothing along those lines. In fact, I said it before and I'll say it again, if you use a pencil to pre-plot out your pattern, that's more or less a rookie move for 90% of the paint jobs that are out there. For this one, however, it's a little bit of a different story because of the geometric pattern. It kind of has to be very exact, specifically here on the side skirts. So I went ahead and used a pencil to go ahead and pre-plan it out. Again, this is one of the very few exceptions to the rule of thumb where when you're applying a pattern, you know, you want to go ahead and pre-draw with a pencil. Otherwise, I just go ahead with the airbrush and, you know, have at it. Like if I was doing this one or any of the other patterns that are found on this color chart here, yeah, nope, that pencil would definitely not be necessary. But for this one here, because I definitely want to keep that geometric turtle-like pattern, we're going with a pencil. So I went ahead and drew it out. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and apply the camo with the airbrush. And I'm going to go ahead and grab the paints now. And, well, let me just go ahead and circle back to when I have the paints already on hand. So I have the paints here on the table. For the green, I'm going to be rolling with Tamiya Olive Green, XF58. And for the brown, Exterior Latex, German Brown. Obviously my own mix. If I didn't have this can on hand, to me a flat brown would be a decent substitute, I think. I also want to mention that the camouflage pattern on the remainder of the vehicle is going to be just done freehand without the need of drawing it out with a pencil. The pencil lines are only going to be used for the side skirts like you see here. So here's the model with all of the paint and the weathering basically completed. At this point here, I'm now painting the rubber parts. So on the Stug, and this is also true for the Panzer III, we have bump stops found on the lower portion here of the model, and these are integrally molded on, but again, these are one of those little bits of detailing that almost everyone out there tends to forget to paint. It's very simply done. Just take some flat black, or in this case to me a rubber black, and just apply it to these locations, and the piece is ready to go. Same thing was done to the opposite side. Right now, I'm actually in the process of finishing off the return rollers. You can see on these ones here, they have been painted. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, generally on these builds, I like to do these at the very tail end of the build, where I paint these things on the runner. So this will allow me free access to go ahead and paint all of the areas to make sure everything is thoroughly painted. Yes, I am one of those builders where I even like to paint the intersections of the rubber tire and even the reverse sections of the rubber tire because I am a very thorough person. But regardless, on this one here, it's not going to be really possible because, you know, the model's already pre-built, and so I'm kind of working within this purview. So for this one here, I am still painting the tires, and I'm painting them as thoroughly as I possibly can. And let me just go ahead and show how to paint a tire like this if this is the type of situation that you find yourself in. Again, this is not ideal. This is something that you should really do more or less as a last resort, but if you come into a circumstance like this, all is definitely not lost. So here I have my paint. It's Tamiya Rubber Black XF85. It is properly thinned out. And I'm just going to go ahead and start the application. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the paint to the outer rim of the tire itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and just go in a flat motion. Because as you can see, I can paint both tires simultaneously. The trick is you want to have the consistency exactly where it needs to be, because if it's too runny, it's going to bleed onto the inner portion of the rim, and that's not exactly something that you want. I first hit the easy to hit areas, which is basically the bottom portion of the wheel, and then I save the harder part last, which is the part here under the fender. This is a bit tricky to get on camera, but hopefully I can do this and it'll stay in focus. This is where you want to have a nice precision paintbrush come in handy. Okay, so there you go. The tire has been painted. And now I'm just going to finish this one off by painting the outer face. When you're painting a tire like this, again, you want to make sure that the paint is only applied on the sections which would be rubber. On many tanks, there is a steel rim that protrudes from the tire area. And you definitely don't want to get any rubber on that. One advantage that the steel rim does have is that it acts as a bit of a retention wall, and in some cases it helps guide the paintbrush to the locations where you want the paint applied. Okay, so this wheel here is now totally completed. Now I'm going to do the exact same procedure to the other two, but there's no point getting that on tape. With the rollers out of the way, it's then time to turn my attention to the main road wheels themselves. As you can see, the road wheels are going through their painting procedure. And again, just like with the rollers, when the wheels are pre-assembled, this does add a little bit of complexity, but it's not too bad. Fortunately, they are not installed or glued on permanently to the model. If that was the case, that would be... I'm not even going to finish that sentence. I don't even want to contemplate that. Which again, it just blows my mind when people glue these things on and try to paint everything. Once it's all assembled, that's ridiculous. That really is quite ridiculous. But regardless, so in order to paint these wheels, I'm going to be painting them in the same format as I paint them basically on the runners, and that is with painting them in layers. So you'll see that I went ahead and painted all of the first row of tires. Then once they were all set, I go ahead and reverse the technique on the opposite side. So the way I like to do is first I paint the inner tire like you see right here. And again, this is where you want to take your time and you want to have a good paintbrush as well as proper paint consistency, just like with the rollers. And I just paint the inner road wheel sections. So the inner tire is getting its rubber at this point. Again, you want to have a nice steady hand. And after a little bit, it's all taken care of. Then go ahead and I'm going to paint the rim, or I should say the tire, on the opposite side. Just like so. Just like with the roller, the rim does a pretty decent job in keeping everything self-contained. Then, as a one last stroke, I go ahead and take care of the outer tire itself. And there you go. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and set this one aside and let it dry. And you'll notice there's a reason why I painted the outer one first, and that's because I could go ahead and manipulate it with my little tweezer, using it almost like a forklift. Okay, so with this out of the way, I could go ahead and flip these ones over. These ones here are dry, and I could do the exact same procedure on the ones on the opposite side. So these ones here are going to be a little bit trickier just due to the fact where I have to hold them, but it can still be done regardless. This is why you want to make sure that the paint is thoroughly dry, of course. The paint's still wet, or it's just like it's at that in-between point, just, set aside and let the thing dry thoroughly. As you can see, you basically just inchworm your way until you completed the paint work. Being a Panzer III platform, this one's not too bad. If this was like a Tiger or a Panther, specifically the earlier ones, ooh, there's a lot of rubber on those things to paint. Okay, as you just saw, I had a little bit of an oversweep with the brush, but I just wiped it off with my finger. Lickety-split, no problems. And that's that. I'm just go ahead and make sure the outer perimeter is taken care of. Okay, so this wheel's done. Let me go ahead and grab that tweezer like I had before. And I'm going to set this guy aside. Okay, so that wheel is completed. All done. Once it dries, I could then mount it to the model. Before the tracks get fitted in place, I'm going to go ahead and thoroughly varnish the model. Off camera, I went ahead and remounted the last of the Pioneer tools. This also includes the spare tires, as well as the spare track. And the model went ahead and received its markings. The markings are the Tamiya water slide decals that were spare from the other Tamiya Stug III ausf.G that I recently completed. In addition to the Tamiya markings, I went ahead and needed to find a cross because with the way you build that vehicle, you'll use all the crosses depending on which one that you utilize. So the cross that you see here was one from the spare bin. This one here was from an Italeri Panther, or that's what at least said on the little paper that the unit was attached to. So, rather than having it languish away in my spare bin, it was being put to good use right now. Now that the water is fully evaporated, I could go ahead and apply the varnish. You always want to make sure that the decal's fully set and there's absolutely no moisture left, residue on the surface. For the varnish, I'm going with VMS matte varnish. This is the same stuff that I always reference in these videos, and for good reason. I absolutely love the way the material gets applied, as well as also with the final end result. It's good quality stuff, and I definitely recommend utilizing them on your builds. For the application, I'm utilizing my airbrush. I have here a Poshy towel, and this one here I basically just use for the varnishing. It's currently patched into my air compressor, and that's currently powered on. So I'm going to go ahead, mask up, and show the actual application of the varnish right now. The only prep work that needs to be done is you got to make sure that the varnish is thoroughly mixed. What I do is I put my thumb over the cap like this, and I shake the hell out of it for at least 60 seconds. If you're wondering why do I put my thumb over the top, well, you'll thank me if you ever get this stuff, because the way the cap is, it doesn't really plug the hole on the top section. And if you go to shake it, it's going to bubble out, and you're definitely going to lose some. So be smart and go ahead and just cap it off with your thumb. Outside of that, no other thinning or anything else needs to be done to the varnish. You just take the varnish, you pour it from the bottle directly to the airbrush, like you see here. It's a little bit foamy due to all it being massively stirred up, and also I'm kind of coming to the end of this one over here, and that usually happens. Regardless, it will not affect at all the application, as well as also the end result. So, I'm going to mask up, and let's get this thing painted. So as you can see, the varnish gets applied very easily, and I just go ahead and take care of all of it in one shot. When I'm holding the vehicle, I'm holding it from the rear axles over there, and I'm resting the bottom portion of the wheels on my finger, and that's how I was able to manipulate the model and get the varnish into the appropriate locations. This is something that you do have to pay attention to, because obviously you don't want a nice thumbprint on the side of your model. It doesn't exactly look all that great. From here, I'm going to go ahead and take the model outside where it's a nice, beautiful, sunny August day. I'm going to let the varnish thoroughly set and dry. Once the varnish is thoroughly dried, then I can go ahead and progress with the last leg of the model's rebuild. With the tracks in place, it's now time to remount the side skirts. So I already added the glue to the appropriate locations on both the top and bottom portions, and now it's just time for standard installation. Once the side skirt's attached, the model is actually going to be getting a secondary coat of varnish. Not nearly as encompassing as the last coat. This one here is going to be applied more strategically. The reason why I'm adding the secondary coat is due to the glue marks that are found on the various sections where the new side skirts have been attached to the model. When you're installing something like this, you will have a little bit of glue in some areas that may blister out or will have a little bit of a sheen, and this is something that can hurt the look of the build. So in order to thwart that, a coat of varnish on top of that will do a fantastic job with mitigating, if not completely eliminating, any traces of the glue that were remaining. And by the way, what I mean by traces of glue is not just like globs of glue, nothing like that, but things like, for instance, a little bit of super glue fog, or even just like a little area where there was a little too much and I wiped it off, and you know, there's a little bit of that residual shine left behind. That's the type of effects that are going to be completely eliminated with the final top coat of varnish. With the last coat of varnish applied, the only thing that remains to be left done on the model is the addition of the MG, the painting of the gloss sections like the periscope prisms, the optic over here, as well as the taillight, and then the very final thing is to add the exhaust rusting agent on the exhaust manifolds, and then finally a little bit of powder fouling on the exhaust as well as on the main barrel. So as you can see, this build is rapidly coming to an end, thankfully, but no point getting that on camera. Let's go ahead and cut across when this model has been finished. Finally, after all that work, the model is fully completed. Let's go ahead and take a quick walk around the model. Starting with the model's running gear, here you can see what the road wheels, the track, the sprocket, and the idler look like in their final format. Not to mention the return rollers that you can get a little glimpse of right over there. As I mentioned before, those are thoroughly painted through, and just because the tank has the shirts in, that is no excuse to not thoroughly paint these components. As for the road wheels, like I mentioned before, they are a mix of the original plastic ones that were supplied with the model, as well as some cast resin replacements to replace the ones that were lost over time. And with the model fully completed, it is impossible to tell which ones are original and which ones are the replacements. It's been so long since I built this one that at the time of filming this video, I honestly could not tell you which one is which is exactly what you're looking for when you're replacing components like the ones here. If you can pull it off and if things look absolutely seamless, you did a job well done. As for the idler wheels, they are painted with the rims being in steel, as would be true to form on the real one. These are steel rim wheels, so the paint would wear off in those locations fairly quickly, although it's a bit tricky to get on camera specifically with the shirts in present, but rest assured they are painted appropriately. As for the sprockets, nothing to talk about here. The kit ones were fine, but this does tie into the track. As I mentioned before, this tank does utilize Rye-Fueled workable track links because the original ones just brittled up and Thanos snapped out of existence. The Rye-Fueleds are a phenomenal replacement, and as you can see, they just complement this build absolutely perfectly. Briefly jumping ahead to the track link review video, these things time flawlessly with the Tamiya sprocket. And by the way, this is the second time that I utilize the Rye-Fueled links on a Panzer III or Panzer IV pattern vehicle, and on both occasions from two different companies, the tracks were absolutely flawless. Be it on the Dragon that I did in the past, to the Tamiya that one that we have here, these tracks are definitely something to consider. They're not that expensive and will just help the build overall. And that's specifically true on the newer Tamiya Panzer IIIs and IVs because they have dreaded individual link and link track. Yes, I was still going to rake those things over the coals even in this video here. But regardless, these tracks are definitely awesome, and stay tuned for the track link tutorial video where I go over that in more depth. Moving to the rear of the model, you get to see the other replacement parts that I mentioned briefly during the build, or I should say the rebuild, which are the toe shackles that we have right here on the back. The original plastic ones did not hold up or were straight up just missing, and they were botched pretty bad when the model was first built originally. The ones we have here are cast resin replacements, and as you can see, once fitted in place, they blend in absolutely flawlessly. Also on the back here, you can see the exhaust manifold. Nothing really much to discuss here. That was a pretty simple part. It wasn't really botched up during the build, but there were some extra clumps of glue that were simply just polished away, refined, and after that the unit was just dropped directly into place when the need be arose. From there, it was just painted and weathered in my usual format. Hopping to the front of the model, this is where there was a bit more of a significant need for repairing compared to the back, where, as we mentioned before, the armor sections were a complete loss on the original model, so they were thoroughly amputated, and the new units were fitted in place. These are the 3D printed ones that were shown before, and as you can see, now that the model is fully painted and weathered, these things are a dead ringer for the original, and the pieces are perfect. They adhered, painted, weathered without any sort of problems, and now that the model is fully completed, you would never have guessed that these were replacements. One other thing I want to mention that I forgot to discuss earlier in the video was when the model was first built, I actually made a mistake with the side hull sections. On the Tamiya kit, these portions here with the lift rings are separate parts that get glued onto cutouts on the hull, and unfortunately when I first built the model I inverted them, and this actually has some detrimental effects, one that some people might not even consider. With the way the kit is designed, you have a certain little chunk or a portion that the final drive rests on, and because the component was inverted, it wasn't sitting properly. During the rebuild, I wasn't able to thoroughly replace the piece entirely, where I crack it off and swap it out, so I had to work around the confines. What I actually had to do was do a significant amount of body work and adjustment with a needle file and some sandpaper to blend in the areas that were a problem, and once that was taken care of, this was the end result. It's a subtle thing to mention, but it is one that I want to bring up for anyone who's working on not just this kit here, but also the Tamiya Panzer III, because the exact same mistake can occur. Be careful, read the instructions, and double check, because again, it's one of those issues that can easily happen to you, and although you can still build the model more or less intact with the parts mixed, it's definitely something that just, it'll bug you when you find out. Also, during the portion where I replaced the armor, the lift ring over here was cracked off, and I didn't get it on video, but I went ahead and repaired it with the original piece that was busted. Once the armor was replaced, this unit here was glued in place, a little polishing done to delete the seam later, and at least for a seamless result, as you can see here. While still on the front, I just want to mention the No-Tech light. This is not the kit original. This is a resin replacement, as is the mounting stem that we have here. The originals just didn't hold up, and so I went ahead and replaced them with the cast resin counterparts. However, that's not the end of the story. The other thing is a cautionary tale, because I gotta tell you, I have broken this thing no less than about 4 times just handling the model around the shop, and even when I brought it here to do the photography and filming. This thing is an extremely fragile and bump-prone location. Just because of this vehicle here with the Schürzen present, when you're trying to pick it up, you don't really want to pick it up from the Schürzen because it is a bit frail. You generally want to pick it up from the back portion that we have right over here where I have my thumb. However, if you try to pick it up from the front, you may have the habit on just reaching right over here to grab it because it does seem like a pretty solid spot. Unfortunately, the No-Tech is in a very precarious spot because you can easily bump it with your thumb, as I have repeatedly. So bear this in mind if you have a Stug III with the Schürzen specifically. Not necessarily on the Tamiya, but any of the vehicles with this type of detailing on it. This little bugger over here is one that just loves to get bumped into and will easily crack off. Fortunately, it didn't go off the lost part yet. I was able to glue it back on, and it's going to stay there. So needless to say, I'm going to feel really good once this thing is tucked away in its nice little plastic cocoon box and set into the collection, or I don't have to handle it and potentially break it ever again. But again, cautionary tale, if you're working on one of these models, be sure not to break your No-Tech light. While on the topic of cast rest and replacements, takes us to the frontal armor as well as also the smoke grenade launchers. All of these were replaced with cast rest and counterparts, and as you can see, they are a dead ringer for the original. And if I didn't mention this or show it in this video, I doubt anyone would have ever realized that these are not the original kit versions. As we saw with the original condition that the kit ones were in, I definitely made the wise choice on straight up replacing them. I'm not sure if anyone's going to be able to see this with the lighting that we have here, but as we recall, the Panzer glass insert was added. Maybe a little bit of sheen can bounce off on the light. Nope, not really. But regardless, there is a little piece of Panzer glass on the inside of the periscope there, and it just makes for a more complete build in my opinion. As for the smoke grenade launchers, again, they have their firing cable details, which was something that I referenced before. And with everything painted and weathered, it really does seal the build off, and it just makes it look that much more completed as well. Continuing upward takes to the armament. The tube's bodywork was a complete success, and the thing is absolutely seamless as any of the other builds that has been seen on this channel. Also on the mantlet, you get to see the other modifications that were made, like the little holes that I added that are absent on the retention ring over here. These were done with the pin vise, and once added, really spices up the build. And on the mantlet, you get to see the cutouts that were referenced before with the multi-master in order to add that natural seam that was no longer present due to the rebuild process. The unit is still fully functional in that it can pivot left and right as per the kit original, and the elevation is also functional as well. If we recall, the inner trunnion section had a quick little modification made in order to stiffen it up, and as you can see, it was a complete success. Also on the front armor over here, you get to see the welds, how much refined they look compared to the way the kit was originally. They are now much more in scale, and now that they are refined, it definitely looks much better compared to the way the model started the project in the beginning. While on this area, this brings us to the Schürzen. As I referenced before, these are brand new with brand new components, and the old ones were just simply left into the spare bin. This was a very smart decision because the original ones were banged up pretty bad. I could have potentially salvaged them, but it was better to just cauterize them with a fresh set since I literally had a set on hand. If I didn't, however, chances are really good I would have tried to just work with the busted ones, and I definitely would have been able to repair them, but again, it's just the path of least resistance in this case. Regardless, they went on without any sort of problems. And after the second coat of varnish, any sort of glue marks or anything along those lines have been blended over, and everything makes for a nice seamless appearance, as you can see here. While on the tin work brings us to all of the Pioneer tools. These are the original kit ones that were all salvaged with the exception of the crowbar. That is a new 3D printed component and was found on that set, along with the stave mounts that we have right here. As I referenced before, the stave was originally supplied with the kit, but was absent for one reason or another, and that part has long been lost to the sands of time. So I went ahead and fabricated the mounts that you see here. However, I made this one, or I'm rendering it with the staves absent. It's a nice way to add a little bit extra flavor to the build, as opposed to having it with the units in place. These are HD 3D printed, as I referenced before, and are found with the other set. On the crowbar, this is also the new one, and as you can see, it actually has the appropriate latch detail there on the tool post that would be found on the real unit. That was simply just mounted to the original location and then painted and weathered, blending into the way you see it here. On the fire extinguisher, on this model here, I rendered it in the yellow format. When it comes to these German Tetra fire extinguishers, you can have them rendered in Panzer Gray or, like I did here, in Dunkelgelb. Either way will work, and it just depends on just whatever works for you or whatever you want to have on your build. It's a nice way to add a little bit of extra flavor to the build. In fact, on the other Tamiya Stug III that I built, I actually painted this in Panzer Gray. Again, just a way to spice things up. Also in this area over here, you get to see the tubular taillight, only this time it's mounted on properly, and I went ahead and painted with that blue color that I referenced before. One other thing to mention about the tools is with the little S-hooks that we have there, those are not the kit originals. The kit original ones were just lost to the sands of time or didn't hold up during the rebuild. Either way, new replacements were fabricated. These are actually made out of pieces of floor wire that were bent to shape in the shape of an S and then flattened to give the look that you see here. The tool post is fabricated out of a thin piece of soda can aluminum that was just bent to shape and then painted. With everything painted and weathered, it blends in remarkably well with the remainder of the detailing. While on that note, this brings us to the spare tires. One of these is the original, and the other one, again, is the cast wrestling replacement. As for which one's which, couldn't tell you. One other thing I do want to mention is that on the kit, it does supply you with the lug nuts that we have right over there that you see protruding from the wheels. However, the original ones were not salvaged, and so in order to replace them, I did the same trick that I went with on my old school Tamiya Stug III ausf.G, where I utilized sewing pins. Just simple sewing pins. I cut them to length, glued them to the appropriate locations, and simply painted them black. With all them looking the same, they'll blend in with the remainder of the detailing, and again, if I didn't mention it, I doubted anyone would have even noticed. Also on the rear deck over here takes to the air intakes. These were pitted with that stupid technique that I mentioned before, and these were also polished up with a little bit of sandpaper and thick super glue. I didn't get a chance to show this on video, but as you can see in the final form, they turned out to be very well preserved and restored back to the condition that we have here. While also on this section takes to the spare track rack. The rack bar itself is the original one that was salvaged. As for the spare tracks, these are brand new and were spares from the other Tamiya Panzer III, or I should say Stug III ausf.G that I referenced before. With the way the kit is, you get a duplicate set of spare tracks. So again, rather than having it languish away in the spare bin, I simply just painted, weathered it, and mounted it in place. Also in this location here, you get to see the replacement antenna bases. These are, again, cast wrestling copies of the original one, and you can see I painted them my usual format. On these German World War II AFE antenna bases, the bottom portion is rubber, and the metal stub that sticks up is brass. You can see that I went ahead and left it antennaless because trying to drill into those sections over there is a bit haphazard, so I just simply left it with the antennas in the off position, which is something that can easily be done, and it's not a ding on the kit, accuracy-wise, if you roll with it in that format. Moving our way topside, brings us to the gunner's optic right over there. Painted it flat black, added a little bit of gloss clear to the lens section, giving it some sheen. Hopefully that comes out on camera. And you can see I did the same thing with the panoramic periscopes found on the cupola. This is probably the most intricate paintwork that's needed on one of these vehicles. Because of the small location that you're working with, you can easily get paint in the wrong areas. So if you take your time and you have a very good precision paintbrush, you should be able to achieve the effects that I've done here. As I always mention in these videos, I like to use flat, or I should say gloss black, for my prisms found on my builds, as this closely replicates the way I've seen these units on the real examples that I've seen in person. As for the remainder of the top, nothing really much going on here. The top was really more or less left intact, with the exception of maybe a clump of glue here or there that were cleaned up, leaving it for the end result that you see here. This brings us to the MG shield. This thing, like I mentioned before, I've broken more times than I can count, and it's another one of those aspects on these vehicles that are extremely fragile, and they just love breaking off just by looking at it. Fortunately, I'm not going to have to fix this ever again, but the piece obviously was the original one and was salvaged, painted, weathered to the following format. Bringing us now to the MG42. As I mentioned before, I said erroneously that the MG42 was supplied with this kit. That is incorrect. The kit actually gives you an MG34. As for where this 42 came from, I couldn't tell you. It just magically showed up on this build. More likely, I probably lost the original 34, and I rummaged around, found a decent 42, and used it in place. I'm not sure if the 42 here is Tamiya or Dragon. Either way, it was a nice 42, so I simply just repainted and weathered in my usual format. The metal bits are painted to look like distressed metal, as I often mention in these videos. And for the stocks, I went with the red Bakelite look, as again, I generally like to render with on these builds. For MG42s, you could make them either in wood, red Bakelite, or black Bakelite. Either way would be suffice. I like to roll with red Bakelite because it just looks great, and I just like the contrast and the color. The color is Tamiya Hull Red with a little bit of Tamiya Gloss Clear added for the sheen. Once it's done, it has, at least for some very nice end results. Also, rolling with a 42 just adds a bit of extra different character to this build, as opposed to rolling with a 34. So in the end, it's a win either way. And that's all there is to the detail work, and this brings us to the paint and the markings. As I referenced before, the paint job is inspired by that real example that I saw on the color chart that was in the Squadron in Action book, and I already went through the paint application briefly in the video, as well as the colors that were used. For the weathering, I utilized my usual approach with the use of a lightning effect. I did not utilize filters though. There are no filters on this vehicle. I just utilized some diluted flat white in the airbrush to get the faded look that you see here. And then I went ahead and counter shaded it with some Tamiya flat black, leaving for the end results. Once the airbrushing was done, I went ahead and dry brushed it to get the chipping and distressed areas that are typically seen on my builds. And of course, I utilized none other than Tamiya panel line accent for the remainder of the weathering work, again, leaving it for the final end result. For the markings I referenced before, these are a mix of the spare decals found on the Tamiya set from the other Stug, as well as also a random German cross from a Italeri kit build of one flavor or another, again, found in my spare bin. Once the VMS matte varnish was added, this is the end result, and as I showed before, it's a really great product. It applies very easily, and once it dries, the end results are excellent. Cannot recommend that stuff enough, and I always end up buying bottles of that stuff whenever they have sales going on. And of course, it wouldn't be an OTR video if I didn't give a special cameo to the other build that helped bring this one to the condition that we have here, which is my other Tamiya 2nd generation Stug III ausf.G. This model here, of course, is the subject matter of its very own model showcase video that can be found on the channel, and I might as well throw the link in the video description below in case anyone wants to look at this build in more depth. But regardless, this build here was the, I don't want to say the donor because that implies that I sacrificed parts on this one and scavenged it for this one. That's not the case. I just borrowed many of the detail components in order to make molds that were able to bring this one here back to life. So in typical OTR fashion, it's because of this build over here, we were able to get this old one fully restored and up to the condition that we have here. It's also advantageous to point out that with the way the kit is designed, you can build it in a couple different configurations. Here we have it both with the long barrel variant, only this one here is with the Schürzen, and this one here is without. So even though I have the exact same kit in my collection, the two look very different from one another. Also, as a quick mention, the kit has the ability to be mounted with the larger ordnance, so you can actually render it technically in 4 different configs. We have version like this, the version with the Schürzen with the long barrel, or you can roll with the 105 in Schürzen or Schürzenless. So, if anything, I think I might need to pick up 2 more versions of the kit in order to just thoroughly flesh it out completely. But either way, these kits are awesome and they just look really good, specifically when you have 2 of them lined up side by side. And at the end of the day, I really cannot be any happier in how this rebuild turned out. This was definitely a redemption arc, and even though this build was way harder than I originally anticipated it was going to be, it was definitely worth it in the long run because the model turned out to be absolutely excellent in its final rebuild form. It always feels good to complete a rebuild, and this one here is certainly no exception. However, because this one is painted with the exact same camouflage pattern that I originally had applied to this model all those years ago, seeing it rebuilt and repainted, but this time with proper painting and weathering techniques, it definitely makes this build live to its full potential. And of course, seeing it in this format over here is definitely one that feels very rewarding. As I frequently mention in these OTR videos, these plastic models are far more resilient and robust than a lot of people think or give them credit for. If you watch this video all the way up to this point here, I want to give you my congratulations. Obviously, I've been doing something right to keep your attention at bay for this long duration of time, and perhaps you walk away from this video with some new techniques and tricks that could help you on your own builds, or perhaps a little bit of incentive and motivation to tackle a build similar to this. We all have builds in our collection that have been built in the past. Perhaps they fell into a poor state of disrepair, or perhaps when you built them the first time around, you made some mistakes on them and just relegated to the out of sight, out of mind stash. Well, after watching this video here, you probably learned some new techniques that could potentially take that model in its current busted condition and clean it up and polish it up to something that can be a centerpiece in your collection. With a little bit of elbow grease and equal parts of determination, you may be surprised on what you can accomplish with one of these rebuilds. As I mentioned before, it always feels good to take something that was completely decrepit and fixing it up, opposed to the alternative, which would be to languish away in a bin or on a shelf somewhere in poor condition, or potentially worse, having the thing end up in a landfill. Neither one of those situations is beneficial to anybody. As you may have guessed it, this one here is definitely going to be put in a nice, clear, dustproof plastic box where it could be visually seen in the ECA collection, and it will definitely not have to worry about it falling apart like the Blues Brother mobile ever again. And with that, that wraps up this episode of Old Tank Repair. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being other episodes of Old Tank Repair, to my other type of content, which would include small-scale model showcase videos and my larger-scale project update videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger-scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Until then.